Hello, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are, and welcome to this new installment of ev Management Consulting's webinar series. My name is Benedikt Unger. I work in ev Management Consulting's Energy division out of the London office, and I look after ev work on e-mobility and the future of transport globally. Over the course of the last months, as many of you might know, we have been focusing on the impacts of COVID-19 on energy markets across the globe. My colleagues have described impacts on electricity spot and forward prices and on particular markets. Today, we thought we'd take a more longer-term focused look and ask the question whether COVID-19 will have a longer-lasting impact on the e-mobility sector in particular, and what the challenges and opportunities for the sectors are after the crisis is over. We're thrilled today to present this webinar together with global law firm Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, as we have Mark Richards joining us later to lead a panel session on our topic. So the format of this webinar will be slightly different from those we presented before. First, before we start, you can ask the questions throughout the webinar using the questions panel, and we'll cover as many of those at the end. And if you miss a portion of the webinar and you have to dial off early, the slide pack and the recording will be emailed as soon as they're available, so we'll make a recording of this. So first, I will give a brief introduction into ev.energy's view of the e-mobility sector in general, coming from an electricity market and networks perspective. Then I will hand over to Mark, who will chair our exciting panel discussion with two industry experts, Chris Darby from ev.energy, a UK home charging provider, and Ian Johnston from Engenie, a UK-wide rapid charging network. And then we are going to have the Q&A session before we end the session. We've had some of your questions in advance, and we'll pick up some of those, but obviously feel free to put some questions in the questions box, and we'll do our best to answer them. If not, we will also follow up after the webinar as well. We also urge that you reach out if you've got any questions, any comments, anything like that. Please reach out to us. And as I said, we are going to make the slides available. We'll be sending those around and make a recording of the session. You can find them on the ev website to view, together with all the past webinars that we've already done. So I'd like to say thank you for joining, and let us dive straight into the content. What does e-mobility mean to an electricity specialist? We've noticed that there is a clash of expectations between two sectors that in the past didn't have much to do with each other. So this example from our hourly modeling shows this clash in data form. On this left-hand side, we show the impact of the mobility sector expectation that electricity will be available whenever, wherever, basically treating an EV or treating EV charging like a socket that you plug in your hairdryer. You don't even think about the electricity that's needed to do that, because you know it will be there. But if we treat EV charging the same under such a model, the electricity demand, the peaks of electricity demand would become much more pronounced. So on the chart, if you look at the gray underlying area, it shows residual power demand. So that's basically all the purposes that we already use electricity for today, such as lighting, appliances, in industry, and so on. And you notice a familiar pattern of ramp up in the morning, a peak in the evening, and ramp down overnight. And the blue area shows inflexible EV demand, or vehicles being charged when they're parked, basically. As many vehicles are parked as soon as people arrive at work, and back after the return from work, these peaks coincide with peaks of already high electricity demand. Now, if you notice the dotted red line, that is the availability, the available electric energy from the grid. And in the future, we expect that not to be as flexible as it is today, because it's relying primarily on wind and solar resources. So in this scenario, vehicle owners would realize in some instances that electricity would not be available and they would risk running out of battery. Now let's look on the right-hand side on the electricity sector expectation. A largely inflexible power system could use the large amount of flexibility inherent in electric vehicle batteries. Our modeling shows that when even around 50% of vehicles are used flexibly, the system could be balanced even in extreme periods. So that's turning or flipping the current principle of supply balancing demand towards demand balancing supply. And that electricity sector expectation sounds great, but will consumers stay confident that they will have enough charge at any point to go where they want? So the thought of grid companies determining the charge in someone's car might turn already electri-skeptical drivers away from thinking about buying an EV. It's crucial that success stories, and I'm sure we can talk about some of those in the panel session, will help alleviate some of these concerns. What about the business model? A quick look at the traditional model for delivering energy to a vehicle shows a fairly straightforward market environment. The point of delivery, i.e. the petrol station, is often owned by the energy provider itself. There's an established supply chain and a limited number of additional players that are active around them. Flipping to the e-mobility model, though, becomes fairly obvious that the picture has become much more crowded and there are many more interactions with additional stakeholders. So point of delivery can be in many different locations, owned by various different entities, including the individuals themselves, the drivers themselves. Energy providers interact with electricity networks. Charging stations can be owned, operated, and managed by 3 different entities. And we've seen many different business models where companies pick and choose from these roles in the picture. So suffice to say, it's become more complex and there are more and more different and new players that get active. We've even seen vehicle companies that previously didn't really have any role in the delivery of energy to the vehicle become active in this space. So before handing over to the panel, let me highlight 3 ways in which we are helping our clients in the mobility sector. So first, we look at EV charging in the same way we look at other investment opportunities in the energy sector, analyzing commercial value on the basis of costs and revenue streams. Then on a higher level, we look at the attractiveness of EV charging markets across the world for market entry. And then taking a further step back, we provide a full service offering, including technical and commercial planning for EV infrastructure from an energy, networks, and traffic perspective. So with that, I would like to hand over to Mark Richards to lead us through the panel session and the Q&A. Hi, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you, Benedikt, and thank you to yourself and Avery for letting me participate in this exciting webinar. By way of introduction, we've got a really exciting panel today. We've got a real sort of diverse space in the EV and e-mobility sector, and we've got a couple of panelists who are across a number of parts of the EV value chain. We've got Chris Darby from ev.energy, who's a Chief Technical Officer and co-founder of what is a fascinating smart energy, smart charge platform. And then Ian Johnston, who is CEO of Engenie, which is a rapid nationwide charging network and also often forgotten funder of this infrastructure as well. And obviously introducing you back as well as part of this panel, we've also got Benedikt from AFRI, who specialises in decarbonisation and e-mobility generally. So we find ourselves in a really unusual time. The fact we're not all in a room together and speaking is a real shame. But we'll make do amend as we do on this webinar. But in doing so, we come at this in a really interesting perspective that clearly our mobility needs in this pandemic environment is somewhat different from those needs in a traditional environment when we're outside the pandemic. So often, I spend a bit of time thinking about this, and clearly you think about what happened before the pandemic, we think about what's happening now, and then we think about what's happening after that. And what we're focusing on in this webinar is the challenges and opportunities for e-mobility after we come out of this pandemic. So if I start first by asking Ian, Ian, what have been the immediate challenges facing Engenie in dealing with this pandemic, and what do you see those challenges are going forward?
Mark, thank you, and thanks for having us here today. I think there have probably been three immediate impacts of the pandemic. So the first clearly is the impact upon the charging network, and we've seen a drop in utilisation at the start of the lockdown, alongside the drop that's been seen by petrol and diesel sales at forecourt. So that drop was somewhere between 70 and 75% in the first weeks. At the end of March. So we've seen that gradually recover as the lockdown has begun to be lifted, but clearly that's all of the CPOs are working right now to grow utilization across their networks, and of course there's been a huge drop off there. From a health and safety perspective, of course, we are running sites where the customer has a touch interaction with our sites, so there have been some health and safety considerations we've had to take seriously in the day-to-day operation, but also in the continued deployment of the network. And we've had to work very carefully with our partners to make sure that we're adhering to all the guidelines whilst making sure that our electrical installations have continued in the right way. I think the interesting piece is that if you look at the pipeline of projects we're delivering, probably in half of those cases, the landlord partners we deal with have been affected by furloughing or other kind of more pressing business priorities, which meant that the deployment has slowed or stopped. But actually, most of the UK's biggest landlords and retailers and councils, they're all still working, albeit from home. And it's quite interesting to see that we've actually secured as many land deals since the lockdown than we had done in the first part of the year as well. So clearly these large multinational partners we work with are still working online, and if anything, EV and sustainability has become even more important on their agenda, given the situation we're in. So that certainly is something which is continuing over the last few weeks. Going forward, I think for us it comes down to two parts. There's networks like ours where we're making huge multi-million-pound investments into infrastructure before the nation needs it. The big question is always, when will we reach mass adoption? And none of us know what the depth of the financial crisis will be, and the impact that will have on consumer spending on changing your vehicle. That, of course, is one big concern. But hand in hand with that, we've all been shown the version of the world that we could have if we can accelerate this transition to cleaner transport. And I think there's no doubt from a consumer mindset, but also from a corporate priority mindset, that sustainability and clean transport is now even more important than it was at the start of the year.
Thanks, Ian. So we moved a bit out of the spectrum of challenges into opportunities. So Chris, you've had a chance to reflect, as one does, on day 52. For day 52, I make it, of the lockdown. What have been your immediate reflections on the challenges facing your business, which is primarily a software business, obviously?
Right. Yeah. So we provide the software that controls when charging happens in a residential context. So we're optimizing for customers' time of use tariffs, for the carbon intensity of the grid, and so on, and optimizing that charging to match with renewable generation as well. I guess the changes we've seen, on the one hand, I mean, there's three main areas, I think. So firstly, the way we work as an organization has changed, and I think Ian's perspective is it straddles the customer and the capital side, and my perspective is much more focused on the customer and the emotional needs of the customer. So I've reflected on the way we've changed as an organization, now working in a distributed manner, and that impacts our use of transportation, be it personal transportation and public transportation. So that leads on to future opportunities where I think maybe we'll see a growth in personal transportation, and the change in behaviors and people taking that look and thinking maybe it is time to get a new car. That rusty old banger outside is not going to last me much longer, and it's going to be more important. The second thing we've seen is the immediate change in charging behavior. So folks are plugging their cars in and leaving them to charge for quite some time, but then not really driving very much, of course. The occasional trip to the supermarket, but that's about it. So we have seen a lot lower throughput of kilowatt hours on our platform. And then the final element is our utility partners. So it's great that we can manage this charging, reduce the cost for the customer, but really the value comes when you bring in the network operators, in the UK, the retailer, the distribution operator, and the transmission system. In other countries and markets, obviously that's fully integrated, but there's still benefits in reducing the cost of the capital outlays through smartly managing the load. And these deals and conversations are continuing. So in much the same way that Ian's experiencing it with his landlords, we're experiencing it with energy companies, which in a way is reassuring that this is the delivery of energy and the consumption of energy is a sort of pandemic-proof business. And it is creating that motivation. And it's always important to remember that the folks who are making these decisions in these businesses, turns out we're all humans as well. So they've seen the impact on the environment. They've probably felt the good green feelings that we feel when we do good things for the planet, and have seen that this is definitely an area that's still a focus. And I think that they're taking this opportunity to take stock of their current offerings in terms of consumer proposition and managing their networks, and looking at those opportunities, and running pilot programs with us, talking about commercial deals and so on. So a mixed bag, but overall, I think a positive opportunities into the future.
Thanks, Chris. Benedikt, clearly you've highlighted the skills and opportunities that AFRY can do to help both existing participants in the e-mobility market, but also new entrants. Where are you seeing your clients' need at the moment? Where are their challenges? What are you reflecting on?
Yeah, so I think when we starting with the electricity side of things, obviously we've seen that the crisis had a big impact on demand for electricity in almost every market, which leads to an interesting dilemma for network companies that have to manage or balance supply and demand, which is difficult to begin with. And I've highlighted before that it's difficult when you have less flexible generation, as in dispatchable power plant on the system. In a low demand world, you have less dispatchable power plants on the system because the wind and solar plants, they will continue to generate, and then you need to fiddle around with the rest of it. So that's been that this low demand has been quite challenging to manage for utilities and networks. On the transport and mobility side, obviously we've seen public transport dropping massively. So even in countries like Sweden, where there isn't technically a lockdown, you see drops in the public transport use of 40% and more. It's been difficult for the OEMs, for the vehicle manufacturers, who are on temporary layoffs and furlough at the moment. But then thinking about what people do now, and what people need, we always talk about the value of mobility itself. And when you think about not being able to use public transport and it being difficult to go outside, the car seems to have, so the personal vehicle, the car, seems to have gained a new legitimacy even, because you have no other way of getting around. So we often talk about when we talk about cities and congestion, that a switch from conventional vehicles to electric vehicles doesn't really help in that regard, because you still have the same amount of vehicles on the road. But at the same time, now that you think about not being able to use a particular means of transport, you're thinking about maybe a car is an important part of the puzzle.
Thanks, Benedikt. Look, I was going to ask a question about what you think the opportunities are, but I think you've all identified really clearly that there are real and tangible opportunities in the mobility sector as a result of some of this, game-changing things that are happening at the moment. Real seismic shifts in people's perspective, people's perception, people's way of working, And as someone mentioned to me earlier, you know, we're not really working remotely at the moment, working pandemic working, which I thought was a good phrase. And now we're working, you know, we need to be thinking about how we're going to work going forward when we've got a bit more normality. But if I just pause for a second, I spend a lot of time transactionally helping people buy and sell corporates and helping with equity and debt investments in companies. So turn this to Ian, because Ian, you wear a funder's hat as well. If you're an investor at the moment, where do you see the opportunities for e-mobility? And you know, capital can be quite flighty. It can decide to go to renewable energy generation. It could decide to go to e-mobility. Make a case for e-mobility, or what is missing that would make e-mobility much more of a sort of a good case for investment?
Yeah, Mark, thank you. I think it's quite a simple answer to this, and the when we were raising money a couple of years ago, there were all of the usual power and infrastructure funders were very interested, saying that we do power, we do transport. This is the space we play in. The one big difference to EV charging infrastructure versus renewable infrastructure is the market risk of when will people use the charging networks, and the million-dollar question is, when will we reach a level of mass adoption of EVs? And I think, yes, there are so many similarities in what we do compared to the delivery of energy assets around the grid connections, the leases, the project delivery, and all the things that we're experts in. But the difference here is we have no control over when the EVs will hit our roads, and therefore you don't know whether you're looking at a payback period of 3 years or 15 years. And I think in the conversations we have with some very wealthy established funders, that is just still a hurdle that's too big for many people. And I think there's still only a very small number of funds that have gone in at an early stage as we are today, and are deploying millions of pounds of capital because of that risk. And unfortunately, Brexit certainly wouldn't have helped that cause. The pandemic is certainly not going to help it anymore. So there's a small pool of people deploying capital at the moment on infrastructure where there's a big question mark over when it will be used. The difference is we all know it will be used. We all know it is the future. This EV revolution is going to happen, but nobody can say when. And the problem is when the money goes out the door in 2018, 2019, 2020, the model can look quite sketchy if you're looking at another 3, 4, 5, 6 years of revenues.
Yeah, and I think I hear that a lot as well. People talk about this. Sure, you sort of roll your eyes at it, but this concept of sort of field of dreams. Build it and they will come, and that's not really an investment model investors really buy into unless they generally do see some real sort of tent poles in the market. Chris, is that, I mean, clearly a different segment of the e-mobility sector, but clearly as you grow your business and look for investment, how are you seeing the interaction with investors at the moment? How would you paint the opportunities for them?
Yeah, I think there's a few opportunities. So just thinking about the capital sort of investment of new electric vehicles and home chargers. I mean, there's a lot of traditional financing models that work well here. I think with battery assets, you think about as a consumer, you think about the lifetime. You think about your iPhone, and after 3 or 4 years, you've got to replace it because the charging's rubbish. So I think a lot of people are leaning on those sort of consumer financing models to finance their vehicles because they think, well, 3 to 5 years, I'll get a new one because the battery's no good. And we're also seeing that in the charger space as well. So the home chargers can represent a fair chunk of cost, and also customers want simplicity. So with electric vehicle charging, we're in this great world where we can offer the fuel, the insurance, the car, and everything all bundled into one flat monthly fee. And there's some new interesting models kind of emerging there. So that's the sort of the hardware side and the customer side. From the perspective of our business, a lot of the value we access through new markets which are coming into creation at the moment. So obviously we have national flexibility and capacity markets and day-ahead markets and so on, and that's sort of an existing science that's available in a lot of the markets in the world. What's a bit more new and exciting is the local markets. So because we're able to track assets down to the feeder level, to your home postcode, we can provide very targeted flexibility for distribution system operators. Now, whether that resonates with the investor depends a lot on the investor's understanding of the market and the confidence in this market. So I think we face the challenge of uncertainty. But those markets are now beginning to open up, especially in the UK and the deregulated spaces like the EU. And I'm very hopeful that we can use those as those examples to illustrate the potential value to an investor elsewhere. You think about the value of a single user on our platform, where we can flex sort of hundreds of kilowatt hours a year versus the average Facebook user where you just stick a few ads in front of them. I feel like delivering actual electrons might be more valuable than delivering ads, but that's another one you need to convince people on.
Thanks, Chris. Benedikt, from your perspective, I mean, your business sees a number of investors making quite binary decisions between investing in real estate related renewable energy generation assets versus e-mobility. Where do you think the balance lies there? Is there could you argue there's actually there's more juice in the e-mobility market in terms of it's less commoditized? Is that one way of looking at it?
Yeah, potentially that's right, Mark. Basically, we have some of our clients who are in private equity or in funds looking at investing in, let's say, green energy assets. They have done renewables deals, and it's become a standard investment, and there's a lot of experience in how to do that. And they are now interested in e-mobility because it's seen as another way of doing a green investment in the space. But that's as you've said before, it's not standard, and you're dealing with more counterparties, you're dealing with more uncertainty. But there are similarities. So if you know how to deal with energy suppliers, if you know how to deal with grid companies, sometimes even the investment sums are in the same range. So if you understand electricity markets and regulations, and you know the players, then it's actually a relatively similar, or at least from the boundaries, it's similar. And then again, Ian talked about the mass adoption of EVs, which is the key factor here, because if you're making an investment now in this, you're banking on this, EVs continuing to grow, and it's a question, when will it happen? And I agree that it is almost certainly going to happen now with where EVs stand. And then it's all about the revenue streams. And if you have uncertainty on one side, can you add other revenue streams? And Chris talks about flexibility and the other things they can offer alongside. So we often get asked about the ancillary services value of a battery in an EV. So basically, what can we offer to the grid in terms of helping them to balance the system? And batteries in general are very capable of doing that, of providing ancillary services. Batteries are super fast in responding. Their charging infrastructure is technically capable of reacting. And obviously many are doing it already. It's just important now that not just in the UK is generally ahead in that regard to some extent of other markets, but there needs to be a market for these services, that these additional revenue streams for EV charging can be properly monetized, and then also looked, can be bankable from an investment perspective.
Thanks, Benedikt. And this really is an unusual time. So if we just pause for a few things. So we've seen the OEM car data that shows in the UK a 97% or so drop in car registrations. The top selling car in the UK being, if not the top selling car or second top selling car, Tesla Model 3. The one below that being the Jaguar I-Pace. Clearly, they're unusual, and it's an unusual month, and there are real outliers in that context. I picked up the FT this morning. It looks like the City of London are banning large amounts of traffic throughout the City of London to ensure that we get some greater visibility of social distancing, because we're narrow streets in the UK. And then we've seen the UK government, just picking 3 examples, UK government accelerating pilots in e-scooter mobility. So that really are in a situation where there's been huge amounts of policy shifting in this uncertain times. I suppose what I was getting to was just pausing on that, direct this at Ian, and great to get Chris and Benedikt's views on this. We're way away from mass adoption. We, all 3 of us, are in a bit of an EV bubble. We know about EVs, we've already owned EVs, and we've worked with EVs for a while. How do we help as an industry, or how does government help? How does the industry help with this march towards greater awareness, greater mass adoption? What are the factors that are going to take this market into another step change, a kind of incremental growth that we're all looking for? And that's directed at Ian.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's 2 things we need the government to do, and the first comes from the fact that we've seen the damage that can be done on investment into infrastructure where governments change policies and change stances. So we absolutely need the government to hold firm and to reinforce the fines that are hanging over the OEMs at the moment if they don't reach the targets on reducing CO2 emissions. So just to explain that a bit further, so for this year and for next year, for the first time, if each of the individual OEMs have an average CO2 exhaust emissions on the vehicles they sell above 95 grams, then they will be hit with a fine for 95 euros for every gram on every car sold. So we're talking about a mega fine, millions and millions of pounds that will be on the OEMs. And that is such an incentive to the OEMs that they will, without public pressure, manufacture more EVs and deliver them to the market. Now, of course, we need the UK government to ensure that that still applies to the UK now that we're not coming under the EU regulations. Of course, there will be huge pressure given the pandemic to relax those regulations to of course secure jobs and the other impacts of the pandemic, but that is a huge driving factor to getting vehicles on the road. And once you put more EVs on the road, there will be more infrastructure built because the risk will be reduced for other investment decisions. So that's a huge thing where we need the stance to be held firm. And the other great example is around the bringing forward of the ban from 2040 to 2035. You know, from our perspective, does it make a massive difference to what's going to happen in the next 3 years? Not really, but what it does do is it says to the general public, so the man and woman on the street, diesel and petrol cars will be banned. And therefore, the change we saw talking to customers was they accepted they would end up driving an EV because these cars are banned by the government. So the conversations we're having with the government today around bringing that ban further forward, working with the OEMs to do that, so that everyone understands that we are heading in this direction and the government aren't going to relax or slow down that transition. The second part we need is education, and in December we launched London's first rapid charging hub at Stratford, and the BBC launched it on their evening news, and they went out into the streets and asked people, you know, oh, is now the time for you to go to an EV? And the unanimous answer, unfortunately, from the people they interviewed was, oh no, surely that must be 3 or 4 years away yet. So somebody on the call earlier said we need to share the success stories to show that everyday people can drive EVs, and people need to understand that you don't need to leave the house every morning with 100% of charge. None of us leave the house every morning with we don't need to leave the house every morning with a full tank of petrol. So there's an education that needs to happen to explain about charging rates, charging speeds, how you charge, how easy it is to use the public networks. And unfortunately, we are within the bubble, we're very bad at talking about 7 kilowatts, AC, DC, in this language that means nothing. So there's definitely an education piece, but if the policy stands firm as it is today, then there will be a big change anyway.
Oh, thanks, Ian. And Chris, any thoughts from I mean, it doesn't have to just be government, it could be industry as well. Any thoughts on how you could see this massive acceleration of e-mobility adoption? Any silver bullets?
Well, I always say there's no such thing as silver bullets, there's just lead bullets, I'm afraid. But I mean, one of those lead bullets is, wouldn't it be great if we had smart meters? But that's a conversation for a different time, I think. I mean, from my perspective, the more folks you get who you're able to, more customers you get, you can settle half hourly, the more incentive you have as a utility to do so, more value selfishly smart charging at home can deliver. So hopefully that makes my investor conversations easier. But I agree with Ian wholeheartedly on the education piece, and it's something we're working on. We work closely with residential charger manufacturers, and we work with them to help them with the OLEV process and to provide them deep integration into the beautiful user experience that is our app. But also it's about making it really easy for the customer to understand what's going on. And I think as EV drivers, which hopefully some of the folks on this call are, and if not, go trade your car in tomorrow. But EV drivers have a great opportunity to be advocates in a very small way. So I was at a rapid charging station, sadly not Engenie, but and charging my BMW. I was actually showing my mum how to charge the car, and she's always said, oh well, I'll get an EV when it's a mainstream thing, and pretty much changed her mind on the situation because it's really simple. And we had someone come over to us and say, this is awesome. What is it? What's going on? Tell me more about it. And just taking that 2 or 3 minutes to explain about electric cars and all the things Ian said about, well, you wouldn't leave home with a full tank every morning. It's not a problem. And this person left and said, great, I'm going to get my daughter to learn in an i3. And the fact that there's now people who will never have driven a petrol or diesel car ever, and there are kids alive today who will just never go in a petrol diesel car, is a pretty awesome moment in time, and we should capture that. We should use that to do a little bit of evangelizing about it when we're out on the road, and when we bump into these folks who are curious and keen but just need that permission or that bravery to make the jump to electric.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really positive note. And Benedikt, you're helping clients capture these market trends, these market movements. What are you hearing from your clients? What are they missing out on? What would they like to see that will really accelerate the growth of e-mobility?
Yeah, so I think from an electricity side, it's a great thing, because I think going back to the slide that I presented earlier about the clash of expectations, that is being broken. And electricity companies understand what e-mobility really is, and they're working together. And it's really important that we understand. So, as you know, we've talked about breaking out of the bubble. We all think EVs are great, but we need to make sure that everybody understands that they are great, because we are convinced of it. And some of the great things are just that it's really easy. It doesn't really mean that you're dealing with dealing with mobility in a completely different way. It's just for us, or for the electricity sector and for mobility providers as well, understanding what consumers want. And consumers, they spend let's say 20 minutes, half an hour in the morning and in the evening commuting. And every now and then, let's say every other week, they go to a petrol pump and it takes them about 5 minutes to go through that. If they have to do, if we expect of them to then spend half an hour to charge up their car, they won't like that. They won't like thinking about, ooh, but my journey is just half an hour. Why would I then add half an hour to my day just for standing around? So, but that's not a hard thing to do. We just need to meet the people where they are, because the car is parked anyway. So it needs to be, and the charging hub is a great example of that. It's something where the car goes anyway, and then it's charged when it's parked. Nothing changes. It becomes even easier because you don't even have to go to the petrol pump anymore. We just need to make sure that we make it easier for the consumer. So both from an electricity provider perspective, from a mobility provider perspective, and whatever other stakeholder it is.
Thanks, Benedikt. I'm conscious of time, so I'll just I'll get the panelists to wrap up now. So we find ourselves in the middle of a very difficult situation. We are still in the middle of a pandemic. At least level 1, if not level 2, of the government restrictions. We will get out of this. We're all clear on that, and we'll find a world where there are opportunities to expand our businesses in the e-mobility sector. Turning to Chris and to Ian and Benedikt, I know you're wrapping up at the end. what would just in a minute sum up? Chris first, then Ian last. Where do you see? What are you most excited about from an e-mobility perspective as an opportunity post-COVID? Chris.
So I think I have a hunch, a belief that we're going to change the way we work fundamentally. I think there's going to be a shift from folks commuting in to centralized offices, because we've shown that a large chunk of our workforce can work in different places. So I think we might see an evolution of where people live, and that will change their mobility patterns. So we'll probably see an uptick in personal vehicle ownership or usage at least, and I sincerely hope that the majority of that is electric as well. So I think that this is going to act as a catalyst to grow electric vehicle adoption, and that might be even grow the personal vehicle market as well, and all for the betterment of the environment and the world we live in, and improve our quality of life. So that's my hope, my vision for what lies ahead.
That's very positive. Thanks, Chris. And Ian, reflections from you.
Yeah, I think the most exciting part for us now is it's all about the customer journey. So yeah, the last 2 years have really been about who can establish themselves as having the right credentials to deploy this infrastructure with the right funding and the right skill set. But now the battle of the CPOs will be kind of won and lost on the customer experience. And I think we have to hold our hands up and say that historically it's been a letdown, and it may have been a barrier to further adoption of EVs. So, I mean, we've announced today that we've just hired a new CTO that we brought in from McDonald's, from a fast food environment, because we all just need it to be so simple for people to take a charge when out on the road. So there's a huge amount of work that all the CPOs and the OEMs need to do to make it so easy to charge your car, as easy or even easier than it is to fill up with petrol and diesel today. So that's where we're spending 90% of our thought process at the moment. And I think that there's going to be some really exciting stuff that comes out, working with the utilities, with companies like Chris's, to make it so simple, whether you're charging at home, at work, or on the road.
Oh, thanks, Ian. That's great, and a very positive way to end the discussion. And I'm like you, I'm very positive about this. And I think, like you, I think us as participants in the industry, being evangelical, even if we're just rapid charging or talking on these webinars, just getting people more up to speed in this is going to be critical, and getting our clients, whether they're landlords or whether they're energy providers, to embrace e-mobility is critical as well. Benedikt, I'll leave you to reflect on the webinar, and also to end the webinar, but also to thank you for the opportunity to speak to Chris, Ian, and yourself, and to share this webinar with you. Thank you.
Well, thanks all. Mark, you've done a brilliant job of incorporating the questions and that came from our guests into the panel, so we don't need to go through that separately. So if we just kick on to the last slide, I would like to thank you all again for participating today in the webinar, both to our guests and to our panelists. Again, my name is Benedikt Unger, and if you'd like to talk more on the topic of e-mobility or the future of transport, feel free to get in touch with me or with any of my panelists. I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you, or with my colleagues at AFRY. Finally, I would like to announce next week's webinar in our webinar series. It will be on renewables in China and the road ahead in the world's biggest renewables market. So make sure to tune in again. And for Chris, Ian, and Mark, I'm Benedikt, and have a great rest of your week.